It's 1899. The Boer War is rampant. South Africa is in disarray. Only 2 years previous, an English gentleman football side called Corinthians visited the country for a 23-match tour. Little did those Englishmen know that 2 years later, a representative African side would travel to the heart of the British Empire and return the favour. You're listening to Sportdec Speaks. I'm Dave O'Grady. This is the incredible story of Orange Free State Bantu FC, who were the first South African football side to tour the world. This story is one of politics, race, and of course, the beautiful game. Our podcast is available on the Sportdec app along with live scores and stats, the latest news and betting. You can download Sportdec by simply visiting sportdec.com. Joining us on the show this week to tell this incredible story is historian Chris Bolsmann. I started by asking Chris about this team that was made up of native African players as opposed to the whites-only team that Corinthians faced 2 years prior. I put it to him that to see this team reach British shores must have been a huge shock to everybody.
Absolutely, you're right. The South African team that toured Europe in 1899 were groundbreakers in many ways. They were the first African side to tour Europe, the first South African football team, either black or white, and were really groundbreakers in many ways. The irony, of course, is the captain of the touring South Africans, Joseph Twy, was in the crowd in Bloemfontein in 1897, and he watched the game of the Corinthians against the Orange Free State White 11. And when Joseph Twy was in England from September onwards in 1899, he was asked whether they would play against the Corinthians, and there was no contact made with the Corinthians, and it was very much a case of respecting those real sort of racial and class lines that had existed in Britain and South Africa at that time.
Because I wonder about that English team that initially went to South Africa to play. Were they surprised to play against a whites-only team? And then, you know, especially considering the situation that was going on at the time?
No, I don't think so, because you'd had a number of cricket and indeed rugby tours from Britain to South Africa during this period, and it was absolutely normal for white touring British teams to play against white-only opposition. There were, however, a handful of examples where an African cricketer or somebody of mixed heritage would be playing in soccer and indeed in cricket. But generally, it was the norm. It was accepted. There was strict segregation on racial lines in South Africa, really from the 1890s onwards in organized sport. So organized sport really comes about in South Africa during this period with the formation of national associations for football, for rugby and cricket. Indeed, all their constitutions of these bodies said that they represented European sportsmen only.
What about football tours in general, Chris? Were there many football tours at this time?
To South Africa, you have the first tour of 1897 by the Corinthians, and they actually returned to South Africa in 1903 and 1907. A white South African team gets sent to South America in 1906. So South Africa is really on the radar of British touring. Initially the Corinthians, and eventually you have the English FA sending an amateur team out in 1910. So South Africa is definitely part of the colonial stopping points, if you like, for various sports.
I guess in the build-up to the tour, one of the major talking points, I suppose, from an English point of view was the players' skin tone as opposed to their ability, which it kind of garnered the most attention. How much of a novelty was it for people in Britain at the time to see an all-black football team come to their shores?
Well, we must remember that during this time there were a couple of black footballers, Arthur Wharton being one of those, playing relatively high levels of football in Britain at this time. So to see an all-black team was indeed a novelty and indeed a foreign experience for the majority of these crowds. And the local press, prior to the arrival of the South Africans in Britain, really suggested that the side was going to be very powerful, very strong, very muscular, sort of really playing into these racial stereotypes, this Darwinistic, the social Darwinism at the time. When the South Africans played their first game against Newcastle in September 1899, it was evident that the South Africans were not particularly good, and that the rhetoric around this fantastic muscular team really turned to one of ridicule, and the side really became the laughing stock. But that also changed, and the South Africans were then seen as pupils of the game who wanted to learn from the masters, inverted commas, in Britain. So it really came. It started off as this racial, this ethnic spectacle, which then turned into an educational or a missionary form of a tour towards the latter parts of their 4-month tour in Europe.
Because their big plan, you mentioned them going and playing Newcastle, and I think their initial plan was to come up against Aston Villa, and I guess in football terms back then it would be like a Sunday team going up against a full-strength Barcelona side. But as you said, what is particularly interesting is people's opinions came around to the fact that this was a group of pupils almost learning from the masters.
Well, that is exactly. I mean, I think your analogy is probably spot on. The South Africans were made out to be fantastic players, and I think the promoters really pushed this because they realized money could be made off these tours, and the South Africans were guaranteed 50% of all gates on their tour in Britain. Joseph Twy, the captain, for example, he actually, in one of the local interviews in Britain, suggests that he only learned to play football in his 20s. And that suggests to me that they were not very good as a team, although there were a handful of players, Adolf, the goalkeeper in particular, who seems to have played particularly well across Europe on this tour, and is reported in a number of press reports suggesting that he even may be signed by a British team, although nothing ever comes of that. And the South Africans returned to South Africa in early January 1900.
I know you mentioned Arthur Wharton earlier, the first black player to play in the Football League, and I was looking up at his position. I was doing a bit of research, and he was a goalkeeper but a winger as well. And I guess back then you had to be quite, especially to make it in the game, and the more challenges if you were a black player trying to make it in the game, the challenges were you had to be more economical with where you played, what position and all that.
Possibly. Although, having said that, the South Africans, despite being ridiculed in the press, I mean, the initial cartoons that appeared were definitely racist, and would not be appropriate by any stretch of the imagination today. But they were feted wherever they went. They were treated as dignitaries. They were met by mayors of the various towns and cities that they visited. A number of smoking concerts were held for them in their honor. And they were really treated as equals. And I think this is really important in the context of a stratified South Africa, where we have the emergence of segregation and indeed legislated racism 50 years later, that they're treated as equals in Britain. And they returned to South Africa with this impetus. And indeed, Joseph Twy is one of the founding members of what becomes the African National Congress, which of course is the ruling party today. Of course, is the party of greats such as Nelson Mandela. And while there's not a link between his experiences in Britain and his politics, sort of 15 years after his return to South Africa, I think we can suggest that there may be a link of sorts.
Joseph Twy, I was reading about him, and I discovered that it was almost like he loved England. He had a lot of respect for the freedoms that he didn't have back at home, and he was almost taking a political stance. It was, he was almost standing behind the British monarchy and what their objectives were in Africa.
I think you're probably right there. We must also remember that as soon as the South Africans arrived in Britain, the South African War broke out. Some of the press actually suggested that the South Africans should be interned because they were enemies, because they were from Bloemfontein in the Orange Free State. But Joseph Twy and some of his teammates came out very strongly against the Boer republics, and indeed, when they played the game against Aston Villa in November 1899, they wore various ribbons. I mean, we can also read into that. Look, they were, of course, in Britain at the time, and they were not going to come out against the British. But it's very unlikely in the context of a highly segregated and racist and Boer republics in particular that he would have sided with the Dutch.
I wonder what the reaction was like in England at the time, the political reaction, I should say, aside from it being a novelty, you know, because you only have to remember the reaction that Ozzy Ardiles got in England on the outbreak of the Falklands War, and that was a lot more recent to this. But was it difficult? What was the reaction like?
Well, the sense that I get from having done archival work in South Africa, my sense is that the crowds were welcoming of the South Africans, because they were a novelty. They were definitely an entertainment factor. They were not particularly good footballers, players in different positions, sometimes even without goalkeepers, and would always win the games. Some games by narrow margins, but the South Africans scored on every occasion. That may suggest to me that the local teams let them score, or that they actually had the ability to score. That we can't tell. But my sense is that the British public was welcoming of the tourists. However, the same can't be said for the South African press. Of course, a number of instances of South African white South Africans writing letters to the South African press suggesting that this is an absolute embarrassment, and how could the South African Football Association, which was the White Football Association, actually allow for such a team to tour Britain, because, as I said already, we had this strict segregation in South Africa at the time. And this was then seen as very problematic and not representative of white South African sport.
Obviously, that was a huge problem for the players as well. And that would have been, I guess, at the back of their minds. Yes, they're playing a tour of so many different games, but at the same time, they kind of know what they're going home to. And particularly, as you said, the press being so much against this team touring, saying it's not their right to tour.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. But I mean, this goes back to South African sport in the 1880s and the 1890s, because you have organized sport played amongst all racial groups in South Africa at this time. But white South Africans in particular are quick to organize national associations, regional, provincial associations, and black South Africans follow very quickly. One of the interesting points of the South African team is that many of these players are from Bloemfontein, but also work on the diamond mines down in Jagersfontein, which is 100 miles south of Bloemfontein. And this would have been a small mining community where there were examples of black and white teams playing against one another. So despite the rhetoric, this overly racist discourse in the South African newspapers, there were examples of black and white teams playing against one another. Indeed, one of the organizers of the tour, Robert Day, actually acknowledges in an interview in a British newspaper that he'd played against Joseph Twy, and there seems to be a real camaraderie and a friendship between the white managers and promoters of the team and the black players on the team.
Yeah, because it wasn't universal to football as well, Chris. I mean, I read about the black cricketer Crom Hendricks in a touring South African team, and 5 years after, this was 5 years after Crom's controversial inclusion, it was kind of clear that little had changed.
Absolutely. I mean, Crom Hendricks was a fantastic bowler in Cape Town, and the South African Cricket Association was planning a tour of Britain, and there was discussion about including Crom Hendricks, and it was Cecil John Rhodes, who of course was Prime Minister of the Cape at the time. He then vetoed this, and he said this was not appropriate, and that goes back to the idea of racial integration and racial mixing, and white South Africans at the time were very conscious that if you had black and white players playing together in sports teams, that would eventually result in some form of equality more generally, and white South Africans were very keen to maintain this segregation and this distinction because they, of course, were in the driving seat. They were the ones in political power.
Again, going back to the return to South Africa, I know on their way back they stopped in northern France for one last game against the Sporting Club Tourcoing, and they won 3-1. I think that was their first victory out of 41 games, and it was in their last match. So it's even remarkable to say, Chris, that a team that we read about that couldn't kicked the ball or passed the ball or tried to tackle each other, they were
Yeah.
able to, after so many games, they were finally able to get together and actually win a game in Europe.
It's fantastic. Yeah, they only play one game in Europe, in mainland Europe. They play in France. It's a side made up of Belgian and French players, primarily from Brussels and Paris, and they won 3-1. And again, going back to some of the games in Britain, one of the newspapers reported that the South Africans were so weak that they should actually go play against women's teams or the French. So I think the South African victory is not unusual because mainland European soccer, the football at this time was still in its infancy, and of course Britain was the standard bearer, and it would be for the following probably 20 years before it gets rivaled by some of the European teams and countries more generally.
And for being so slated in the South African press, they said it had damaged South African football and that. Is it still, on the other hand, is it fair to say that this was the first football team to use the beautiful game to oppose the apartheid regime that was existing in South Africa?
Well, apartheid comes into being much later, 1948, but I think it's an important idea that you're referring to, because this is the first African team, a significant marker in many ways, playing football, playing the beautiful game. And from my research on this tour, it was very evident to me that there was very little that had been written in South African sports history more generally, and that for me was because it was an African team, because it wasn't a white team that had travelled abroad, and they were had been written out of South African history more generally, and sports history in particular, and that for me was very revealing. And I think, yes, we can say that they stand up to segregation and racism of sorts through their interaction with British teams, treated as equals. And then coming back to South Africa, indeed, and Joseph Twy in particular playing a significant role in the formation of the African National Congress, and he indeed also becomes the treasurer of the ANC later on. So they are standard bearers, and I think they're absolutely unique in South African sports history, and a side that we need to consider, and a side that we need to look at more. I mean, I'm sure there's more that we can do research on.
Will history go down as saying that this tour was a success in achieving its goals? And, you know, even if they set off without the strong political goals that they had, or from a performance perspective, given that England's international team only experienced its first defeat outside of Britain in 1929, was this a success, do you think?
Well, I mean, I think in sporting terms, no, it wasn't. The analogy of a Sunday team versus Barcelona, I think, is apt. So on the playing field, no, they weren't. Financially, it seems that the tour ran out of steam towards the end of December and early January, and the team then returned to South Africa rather than going on to Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, as had been suggested in some of the press reports. But I think if history is going to judge this team, I think we need to see it beyond the financial and beyond the sporting contest. I think we need to see it in terms of an African sports team that goes to Europe, and despite not playing particularly well and not playing particularly good football, they are treated as equals on the sports field, and indeed in the functions and the events that they attend. So for me, I think if we look at it in those terms, I would say it is a success, and that's where sport can have that impact of treating people as equals, because we have a set of rules, and we have a game, and we have a referee that regulates the game. So I think that's where sport can bring about equality of sorts.
I'm sure, Chris, you found a lot of research when you were working on this, and you know, you look at previous productions, the likes of the movie 42 featuring Jackie Robinson and with the baseball and there's other stories of the likes of Viv Anderson becoming the first black player to represent England. This could be a movie in itself almost.
Absolutely. I mean, it's one of the most exciting bits for me when doing the research was actually meeting the grandson of Joseph Twy, the captain, and he still lives in Bloemfontein in South Africa, and he had no idea of his grandfather's role in the tour, and that for me was really humanized the experience, and really sort of brought home how important this tour actually was. And then in addition to that, I mean, one of, as a researcher, as a scholar, looking through archives, finding the photograph of the team posing in I think it's in Southampton on their arrival to Britain, posing on a leopard skin. I think really sort of reference to the time, reference to the period. And this photograph in the National Archives in Kew has just sort of brought the team alive for me and made it real in so many ways. Moving beyond the text of the newspapers to actually seeing an image, a photograph of this team.
How far do you think South Africa has come in a football sense and, the politics around it? Obviously, they have been to a few World Cups. It hasn't gone very well. But in terms of inclusion and, are we still looking at I know it's not a fully all-black South African team nowadays, but it's still... There's still that, when you look at the other sports, the likes of rugby and cricket, and then you bring in the football into it, the division is still there almost as much you can see.
I think I partly agree with you there. However, I think that to see South African sports in terms of rugby and cricket being white sports and football being a black sport is wrong. And why I say that is that during this time of the tour, you have a number of black South Africans playing cricket and rugby, and indeed you have a number of white South Africans playing football. And another field of research, another project I'm working on is on football in South Africa in the 1950s and 60s. And you have a professional initially a professional white soccer league known as the National Football League, and you have 6 members of the England World Cup winning team of 1966 playing as guest players during their holidays, during their summer months in apartheid South Africa in the National Football League. So you have this whites-only football league where you have segregated stands of black and white spectators. But this is by far the most popular sport during this period. You have crowds far exceeding those of rugby matches and indeed even international matches where the Springboks are playing. So I think this is a bit of South African sports history that we don't know enough of. Where we need to look at it not necessarily in terms of race, but in terms of class, and that football in South Africa is primarily a working class game, and that would have been for white working class people and indeed black working class people. So, no, we haven't been particularly successful, and that's a great shame. After the impetus of the 2010 World Cup, we were of course the first host nation to be knocked out in the first round, and in many ways the game has suffered, but. Putting on my South African football cap as a fan, obviously we live in hope, and we hope that we can qualify for continental and of course international tournaments.
Because there is a huge African influence on today's game. There's players from the African continent all over Europe playing in the best leagues, and at the major tournaments, the likes of World Cups. I know you mentioned South Africa's poor performance at the 2010 World Cup, but traditionally the African teams do quite well, and there's a lot of arguments now, Chris, that with the expansion of the World Cup, there should be more places for African teams, and that would probably do a lot to get a bit of excitement, particularly in South Africa.
Absolutely, I agree with you, but I think we need to look at sport in South Africa in more detail. If we look at the cricket and the rugby team, the majority of players representing South Africa at the national level in cricket and rugby come from private schools in South Africa, and these are schools that have the most incredible facilities and the best coaches with the best dietitians and nutritionists around them. Whereas many of these young footballers are learning to play football on the street rather than in organized clubs. And in the majority of schools that these young footballers attend, both girls and boys, do not have organized football as a part of the school curriculum. So I think it's a structural issue in South African sport, and it also has to do with class more generally. I think this is one of the legacies of apartheid. So indeed, 20 years after the first free democratic and free election, still have this legacy of inequality in terms of education and access to sport and sporting facilities.
Yeah, that's a very fair point, because I'm thinking of now, for the development of football in South Africa and other African countries, it's almost reliant on the money that's been pumped in from European clubs. I mean, we've seen the likes of Manchester City, the super rich. They've set up an African academy where they can cherry pick the best young players from around the African continent. Chelsea are doing the same, and it's ready-made. And as you said, the difference with the rugby and cricket, they're coming from the private fee-paying schools with the unbelievable facilities. Football is reliant on almost the European money coming into it.
Yeah, I think you're right there. And in the South African context, we have an example in Cape Town where you had a South African team being bought out by Ajax of Amsterdam, and as a result, we have Ajax Cape Town and Stephen Pienaar is an example of somebody who came through that system. So it is highly problematic for South African football, trying to firstly compete with European leagues, trying to hold on to players. Of course, the South African league is the richest league on the African continent, but in many ways, we're getting players that don't necessarily make it in Europe straight away, or will use South Africa as a stepping stone. So you have a number of South African teams that have a number of foreign African players who would possibly use it as a stepping stone to get to Europe, and that means chances for South African players are limited. Although I'd also argue that there are not that many young South African players coming through because of the issues around facilities in school and education and sport in the curriculum I mentioned earlier.
And just before I let you go, because it has been a fascinating chat, Chris, I don't want to end on a bleak note, but is the future bleak for South African football, or is there hope there still?
Well, I think we have to look at it in terms of the English champions. I mean, look at Leicester City. Who would have thought Leicester City would win the Premier League? So, as a South African football fan, we have to live in hope. There is no other way. I think that's what it means to be a sports fan. We carry on and hope for the best, and we do the same in terms of South African football.
That was historian Chris Bolsmann talking to us here on Sportdec Speaks about the Orange Free State Bantu FC, who created history in becoming the first black South African football team to tour the world. An amazing story altogether. We're out of time for this week, I'm afraid. Remember, you can contact the show by tweeting at Sportdec app. We're also available on Facebook. Don't forget, you can keep up to date with this and all our podcasts by downloading the Sportdec app. You just get down to sportdec.com and follow the link and you'll find it. Sportdec Speaks is released every Tuesday, and we'll have another podcast on Thursday with the Sportdec Insight. We're available on iTunes as well. Just search for the Sportdec podcast. I'm Dave O'Grady. I'll talk to you soon.